Shivani, I think despite your repeated questions to the Congress spokesperson on why should the Hindu temples alone suffer the government's presence, honestly speaking, there's no answer that's been forthcoming from this particular gentleman. And when the very same question is put, whether money owned by Muslim institutions and Christian institutions don't fall within the definition of so-called public money, there is still no answer. Most importantly, I hope the person has read this law. It is not public money, it is community's money. Public effectively has a secular character, community has a religious character. Let us make the distinction very, very clearly. So when the community's money is involved, no government has the business to enter that particular picture. The Supreme Court has clarified over and over again that unless and until you have proof of mismanagement, you cannot enter. And when there is mismanagement, you enter for a very limited and temporary period. You set the house in order and you respectfully get out. That is the position. So I don't think this gentleman actually understands what the position of the law is. On the contrary, the argument being presented is that somehow regulations must be strengthened so that the officers' hands can be strengthened, when the very issue is that officers themselves are corrupt to the core. And regardless of the party, so to speak, regardless of the dispensation and power, so to speak, temples bear the brunt of state-based corruption, state-sponsored corruption, statist corruption. That is the position. And there is no business that a secular state has in a religious institution. This is a fundamental position that perhaps this particular gentleman of the Congress party is not able to wrap its head around. Sikh community has its own religious institutions which are managed entirely by elected representatives. In the sense, elected members of the community, not elected members of the parliament or the assembly. Christian institutions have no legislation. Muslim institutions do not tolerate any interference from the government. Only Muslims handle it, and apart from that, there is a significant amount of community representation in its management. What is the position with respect to Hindu institutions? Why should Hindu institutions alone suffer this? Is the Congress willing to take the position that Bharat is a Hindu Rashtra so that it can justify the fact that government can interfere with temples alone? Let them take the position first of all. And the point that is being made is that because Rajas in the past also used to patronize temples and therefore governments can do this. Sorry, are you comparing a monarchy with a parliamentary democracy which is governed by constitution? Second, after construction of temples, historically this is a recorded fact, the temples used to be dedicated to the public and it used to be managed by representatives of the community, not by the Raja. So let them at least get their history right, even if they don't get their constitution right. So on no count, I repeat, on no count is this gentleman correct. He's got his facts wrong, he's got his law wrong, he's got his constitution wrong, he's got his history wrong.
Sai, I also want to ask you, now that Karnataka has announced this, and I'm specifically saying this because, you know, Uttarakhand decision was a little bit different, and I outlined that in the beginning. Karnataka government announcing this, how momentous do you think it is? And will this force other southern states where there are large temples being controlled by the government to pay heed to this movement?
Shivani, knowing India the way it functions and knowing how political parties operate, let us remember that it was under Sri B.S. Yediyurappa that this announcement was first made. And we are seeing this announcement being repeated once more. So I would want to wait and see what this translates to in the form of a legislation before celebrating prematurely. That's point number one. So until and unless I see this particular declaration and proclamation translating to a very clear withdrawal of a legislation or a toned down legislation, I am not going to get my hopes up with respect to other states. So let us see whether Karnataka follows through. I would certainly welcome the declaration by the state government that this is a very public expression of intent, and therefore there is a consequence or an obligation that follows, and to that extent I would welcome it, but with a certain degree of caution, because I would want to see what is the follow-up or a follow-through, and then I'd like to see what it translates to. But the most important thing is that the tireless work of Swami Dayananda Saraswati, of several campaigners and several lawyers for that matter, like Sri C.S. Vaidyanathan, Sri Venkatramani of the Supreme Court, all these people have been contributing to this particular movement for several decades now, or at least for the last 15 years. This has translated to a significant public chorus putting pressure on the government, or at least the government sees an incentive to act on this or a disincentive to not act on this. To that extent, I think the Free Temple movement is beginning to smell a hint of success. I'd like to see where this goes.
Okay. D.K. Giri, you know, this is a historical wrong that needs to be corrected. Not only is it, you know, patently unfair on the Hindu community, even the arguments for some sort of temple regulation or control or management have frankly been defeated over the last few decades, because we see exactly the opposite happening. And judgment after judgment have told governments, especially in a state like Tamil Nadu, for example, to mind their business. And yet, year after year and decade after decade, we see governments trying to misuse temple funds.